Alright, hi everyone. This video is going to be building Medium one more time. We'll go from the top, even though we did this in a live video this week, but I want to cover it again. I want to start from the basics. We'll try to, in this specific stack, try to build something like Medium. The stack being React for the front end, Cloudflare workers for the back end, Zod as the validation library, type inference for both front ends and back ends, deploying npm packages, something I haven't mentioned here, but something that will happen, TypeScript as the language, Prisma as the ORM, Postgres as the database, and JWT for authentication. That's the high level stacks that we'll be following. It's very similar to the live video we did. I've made a few changes, but other than that, the first 6 slides are going to be a recap basically, because we already covered this in 13.1. The next slides are going to be us finishing the backend. So we finish the backend first, and then we'll move on to the front end in the next video. Let's get right into it. Let's kick things off by initializing the backend, which here are the instructions, but it's fairly straightforward. We've done this a few times now. I'm going to open a terminal. And what is the thing that you have to do in the terminal? Go to the folder in which you want to put your projects. I usually put all of my projects in /projects/100x, and then you initialize Cloudflare workers. There are two things you can do here now. Number one, you can run npm create hono at the rate of latest. That will generate an empty hono project for you. Not exactly empty, it will have a few things. Let me call it week 13 offline. And you have to select the runtime, which in my case is going to be Cloudflare workers. Let me say I want to install. Let me select npm for now, but would urge you to slowly start to get into either yarn or even bun if you want to get fancy as the package manager, because as time goes by we'll be moving away from npm. It's not really used, as in like it's depreciated. People don't love using it, which is why we'll be moving to something like bun or yarn officially very soon in the cohort, but for now it does not matter. And then wait for it to initialize the project. A lot of Windows folks are facing issues here, as in npm create hono at latest does not work for them. For you, I would urge you to just Google hono boilerplate TypeScript Cloudflare workers, something like this, and they should give you a not this GitHub. Basically, rather than using this CLI, this command line interface to initialize it, try to find a repository on GitHub which has this specific code. This is a little too big of a repository, but let me see if I can find one really quickly. Because if you're stuck on initializing the project using this command for like over an hour, it doesn't make sense. A lot of Windows people are facing it, which is why. Let me find a very nice starter kit that you can clone, rather than doing all of this using the CLI. This is a little too much. Source. Oh, it's a little too much as well. Let me push one. There you go. So if you are facing issues running the first command that lets you initialize the project, you can just get it from here, and if it does already work for you, then you're good to go. Either way, once you're done with this, open your project in Visual Studio Code. If you did it via the GitHub repository, path, then just clone the project and then open it. If you did it via the CLI, works either way. By the end of it, you should have this empty hono project in your application. This is something you just bootstrap. A lot of times in Express also, you just run a CLI and get everything locally. If you want, you can create an empty project and set it up from scratch. But usually, getting these boilerplates is a good starting point, so that you have a basic setup of tsconfig, wrangler.toml, things like these. You can always create these files yourself, but the boilerplate code sort of helps you get off the ground. Cool. That's the first thing we did. We have an initialized TypeScript project that has Hono as our HTTP layer, or our routing library. Next up, we need to initialize a bunch of routes. So here is where you can do very fancy routing if you want, or you can put everything in a single file. For now, I'm putting it in a single file. Eventually, I'll add very nice file-based routing. But for now, what do I have to do? I have to initialize a few routes. What are the routes that they want us to initialize? What do you think will be the routes in a Medium-like application? If I go to medium.com, what do I expect to support? Number one, authentication. So sign up, sign in, things like these. Number two, seeing all the blog posts that other people have posted, maybe the title and a small description for them, and then actually opening it and seeing all the details for an individual blog post. This is a basic version of Medium. Of course, there will be 10 different things. They have comments, they have linking to other blog posts from a single blog post. We're not going that deep. So the basic set of routes that you need to support, this seems like a decent list for it. Might be good to add more routes to add things like comments at the end, add things like authors, but we're not going that deep initially, at least for now, which is why this is a good starting list of endpoints that you can support. Sign up endpoint, sign in endpoint, blog endpoint to create a blog, which is a post, blog endpoint to update a blog, which is a put, blog endpoint to get a blog from Medium, for example, this specific blog right here. And the last one is get blog in bulk. This is one that we did not have in the live video. I've just added. This last route will give you all the blogs currently that exist for this landing page. As you can see on the landing page, you see a bunch of these blogs. So if you want to support a page like this in your application, you need a route that gives you all the blogs from the backend. That's what this last route is. Cool. You can initialize all of them in the same file, or you can do very nice file-based routing. For now, I'm putting them in the same file. Eventually, I'll do file-based routing. Cool. Let me quickly write them. Alright, this is a decent list of all of these endpoints codified in the Hono syntax. What's the Hono syntax? Very similar to Express, only it doesn't have two arguments here, it just has C. Again, we're not using Express, we're using Hono because Hono is a library that actually works in Cloudflare Workers. Express does not. Cool. Now that we have initialized this code, none of the route handlers do anything, but it works. If I run this locally, if I run npm install followed by npm run dev, I should probably put this on the left and put this on the right. There we go. You will see it starts the application on localhost :8787, and if I go to /API/v1/blog, it says hello Hono. If I change this to hello Hono 2 and refresh, it says hello Hono 2. Cool. So we have the application. I'm actually surprised that the landing page, or the slash endpoint, is returning me. It is returning me a 404. I had forgotten to save the application. Now that I saved the application, /API/v1/blog, if I send a GET request to it, which is what your browser sends, the control reaches here and the browser gets back hello Hono 2. You can test all of these endpoints. Right now they do nothing, but if you want to, you can open Postman and send a post request here. Let me do that really quickly to show. I'm opening Postman and let me send a post request to /API/v1/blog. If I send a post request, it says hello Hono. If I send it to some random URL, it says, well, it says worker started. Please request the request again. So this just crashes the server, which is why we see what we see for a second. Yeah, it does crash the server. Maybe it does, I don't know. But either way, you get the idea. If I send a request here, this specific endpoint does not work. If I send it to /blog, the one that we have a route handler for, then it returns back hello home. Cool. Let me minimize Postman. Let me go back to the next slide. Initialize Prisma. This is the, still the process of bootstrapping. We are still initializing the project, not writing any application specific logic yet. We are not, writing a medium application specific thing. We are just bootstrapping our application, which means making sure we have a nice database setup, we have Prisma setup, and then eventually writing the real application logic should be fairly straightforward. Cool. The first thing you have to do, get a database. You can go to either Avian, which I am going to go to, or NeonDB, does not matter, both of them are fine. They give you free Postgres databases, so you can go to avian.io, sign up and create a new Postgres database. I already have one. So let me open it up really quickly and copy over the connection URL from here. We've done this many times in Postgres. This URL is how you can connect to your database. So let me copy it and let me just keep it here for now. I will need to use it eventually. If this is the first time you're setting up a Postgres database, go to avian.io, click on create example data. Oh, no, not this. Click on create service and then select Postgres, select the free plan. And then, I cannot create one because I already have one. But you will be able to create a free Postgres database. When you do, you should see something like this. When you click on it, here is your connection string that you can copy. Keep it handy for now. We'll see when we'll use it later on. Next up, we need to get a connection pool URL from Prisma Accelerate. This one is important. You need the connection pool URL if you are using Cloudflare Workers. This URL isn't enough. A database isn't enough. You need to create a connection pool. And if you need a more detailed explanation, we had it last week as well as in the live video for this week. But the long story short is, whenever you are using Cloudflare Workers, which, if you remember, create a bunch of serverless functions for you throughout the world. This is the world map. And if I deploy this Cloudflare app that I'm running, it will create multiple instances of that application. They will be deployed all over the internet. And it is a bad idea for all of them to connect to my database, because my database has a limit to how many open connections it can have. So whenever you have a serverless architecture, whenever you have multiple servers or multiple mini machines where your backend will be eventually deployed, you don't directly connect to the database. So this is wrong. And what is the right approach? The right approach is that each one of them connect to what's called a connection pool. Which connects to your database. And again, we have covered this in detail in week 12 in a video on connection pooling. We also discussed this in week 13.1. Feel free to go there if you feel stuck. Let me get the connection pool URL from Prisma Accelerate, which is this website right here, prisma.io/dataplatform/accelerate. Let me log in. This is how Prisma makes money, by the way. Or this is their monetizable offering. Which is database caching, and specifically in our case, providing connection pools, which are super important, or not even important, they're necessary when you have an application like this, when you have a serverless application that you're deploying all over the internet. Cool. It's taking longer than expected. There we go. What am I trying to do? I am trying to, given this database URL, trying to create a connection pool for that database. So for that, copy over this URL and create a new project here, call it whatever you want. So this is like really slow. All right. And then select Accelerate, because that is their offering we're using. They provide 10 different offerings, which is the one we want today. We want global database cache. We don't want that. with scalable connection pooling. This is what we want today, which is why I'm going to click on enable accelerate. Again, we covered all of this in week 13.1. No, 13.1 and also 12.5 or 12.6. It asks you to paste your database URL here. What are we trying to do? We are trying to create this thing right here, and this thing needs to know the final database URL. This thing needs to know how does it talk to your database, because eventually your backend will be connecting here and your backend will be forwarding sort of the Postgres requests to the database. So this guy needs to connect to this guy through this pool. This pool is what we are trying to create. Paste this right here. Select the region. I'm selecting US East for now, but generally wherever you have deployed your database is where you should have the connection pool as well. Once you do this, it will give you another URL, which is your accelerate URL, which is the URL to this pool. This is what you will use in your Postgres application, in your Node.js application. This pool URL is what you will give to your backend. You will not give the database URL. Cool. Let me generate an API key next. This is something important you need to do. This will give you, if it worked, it did not work for me. Let me do that one more time. Refresh. There you go. This will give you a URL which looks like this. It starts with Prisma. Harkirat, until now our URL started with Postgres. This one starts with Prisma. Yes, this is a Prisma specific URL. And what does it let you do? It lets your backend application connect to your database through the pool. This is the connection pool URL. Cool. Let me also keep this handy on the side. So I have the main Postgres database URL. I have my Prisma accelerate URL. What is this URL, Hakirat? It is the URL to the main database. What is this URL, Hakirat? It is the URL to the connection pool right here. What will I give to my backend application, Hakirat? You will give the connection pool URL. Alrighty, let's move on. After you have step 1 and step 2 covered, after you have created your database and your connection pool, you need to initialize Prisma. That's what we're going to do next, which is pretty much the same how you generally initialize Prisma. npm iprisma followed by npx prisma init. What does this do? It creates a empty prisma/schema.prisma file for you. Let's make this full screen and try to explore this really quickly. What is this schema.prisma file? Has a bunch of comments. Let me remove them. Says that my provider is this Prisma client.js. Ignore. My provider is what? Postgres. Harkirat, can we use Mongo? Yes, you can put MongoDB here if you want, but we have a Postgres URL, which is what we're going to use today. This is the standard thing that Prisma provides you. It lets you connect to multiple database offerings. The one that we're connecting to is Postgres. And the URL is env of database URL. Harkirat, where does this database URL come from? Should I do this? Should I replace this with, my Postgres database URL, Postgres : whatever I got from AVN? You can do that, but generally it's good practice. Okay, whenever you run npx prisma init, it also generates this .env file for you, and this is where you should put your database URL. So let me remove the database URL they had there by default, and let me add a URL here. Question is, which URL should I add? Should I add this URL or should I add this URL? And the answer is, this .env, whatever you paste here, is what the CLI will use. Harkirat, what is CLI? This thing right here. If I run npx prisma generate, or if I run npx prisma migrate dev, if I run the commands that actually run the migrations on my database, they will pick the database URL from .env. Harkirat, so the backend will not pick from .env. No, the backend will pick the database URL from wrangler.toml. If you remember, we covered this a bit, but this wrangler.toml file has a comment at the top called vars, which is variables, where you put all your environment variables. So this is where the database URL will be picked by index.ts. And what does index.ts need to have? What does my backend application need to have? It needs to have the URL to my pool, which is why here I will paste the URL to my pool. this Prisma accelerate URL. Okay, Harkirat. But then what should I put in .env? What should this npx Prisma migrated dev run on? Harkirat, how does it matter? It can run either on the pool or on the database. Yes, but it cannot. Whenever you're running npx Prisma migrate dev, it does not support connection pool URLs. You cannot just put a random, not a random, like you cannot put the pool URL here. You need to put the real database URL. Harkirat, then there will be problem. All these mini machines will try to connect to the database. No. This command you only run once when you're migrating your database. This only happens anytime you change your Prisma schema. So this you run locally, or usually you run in an AWS box. You run it only once. So this won't run in serverless fashion, which is why it does not matter if you have the real Postgres database URL here. And that's exactly what we'll put. You cannot put the other one anyways. It will give you an error when you're running CLI commands. Okay, I do not support accelerate URLs. So I'm going to copy the raw URL here and paste it over here, and we're good to go. We have put our database credentials in the right .env files, the top level .env for schema.prisma, so that this picks it up from here. So if I run npx Prisma migrate, it connects to my real Postgres database. But my index.ts will pick it up from wrangler.toml, where I've put this very long Prisma URL. Cool. Alrighty, this is great, Harkirat. We have step 1, 2, and 3 done. Excuse me. Step 4 is initializing the schema. What is our application? And the application is it's a medium-like application. Don't look at it here, even though if you want you can. But I would urge you to think of the schema yourself. What should the schema be? Most applications will have a user's database where you will store the credentials of your user. So there will be a model called user, which will have probably an ID, which is at default auto increment, something like this. At ID integer or whatever number. I might have to take a hint here. Let's see. Let me write it down and then I'll fix the errors. I'm sure I'm missing the syntax a little bit. It will be the whatever first name, which will be a string, and then last name, which will be a string. You can get as elaborate as you want. You can put date of birth here, but let's not go there. Let's keep it very simple. Let's just keep name. Name string, username or email, which will be a string, and this will be unique, and then password, which will be string, which will be at not null. Now, how do you make it not null? We'll see. Oh yeah, this is how you make it not null. Username is required. Name is not required, it can be null. Username is required, password is required. ID is the primary key and by default auto increment, but the syntax is incorrect. Probably this needs to be I don't know, let's see. Integer and then at ID, that looks right. And then at default auto increment. There you go. Why was it wrong? I don't know, but it works. If you have the Prisma extension here, if you have installed the Prisma extension in Visual Studio Code, it will give you a bunch of suggestions, which is how I was able to arrive at the user schema. It looks pretty good to me. Again, you can make it as elaborate as you want. You can add, date of birth, address, 10 different things, but let's keep it simple. And the other model would be a blog model or a post model, whatever you want to call it, which will have what? Again, firstly, it will have an ID. Let me just copy that from here to here. Then it will have a author ID. Okay, who is the author of the specific blog post, which again is an integer, because this and this will eventually be related. What is related, Harkirat? Go back to the relationships class from week 12 where we discussed how you can relate data, how you can create foreign keys in Prisma. Next up, the actual content of this specific post, which will be a string, and then you can add a thumbnail, which will be a string, which can be optional, like the image thumbnail, because if I go to medium.com, I just saw this, so it came to my mind. Along with the title and the content, there's an image with every blog post, so you can add that if need be. I'm not going to and we're going to add the content and then maybe the title, which will also be required. Cool. This is how I can model my schema. This looks like a pretty minimal schema for an application like Medium. Let me go to the blog here and compare what I had written before and what I've written now. ID, email, name, password, that looks right. There's a relation I've added here. I'm going to add it here as well very soon. And again, you should go to the relationships class if you want to understand why this line and this line are needed, what these lines do. And then post has an ID, has a title, has the content, has published as a boolean, which, yeah, let me add that as well. And then author ID. So yeah, this and this look very similar. The only thing that I've missed is the relation, actually relating data from this users model and this posts model. Hakirat, what does that mean? What does the relation mean? Go back to 12.3, 12.4 where we discussed it, but at a high level. If you don't need this line and this line, you don't need to relate data. You don't need to tell the users model ki bhai you will have a bunch of posts, and you don't need to tell the post model ki bhai this author ID that you have is actually a foreign key to the users table. You don't have to add them, which basically means you don't have to add this line and this line. But when you add them, you guys get very nice constraints. What is a constraint, Hakirat? Basically means if let's say I put 3 entries in the users table with an ID 1, 2 and 3. If I try to add a post and I give it a author ID of 100 for a user that does not exist, my database will throw an error. Because I added this relationship, because I told Prisma, which told SQL eventually, okay, my users and posts are related, the author ID here needs to have a relationship to the user. You cannot put a post for a user that does not exist, right? So that's why you need this relation. Let me add it here as well. Happy to put them side to side. The final thing that I've created is pretty close to what was expected here. So a user will have posts, which is an array of posts or whatever, blogs. Let's call them blogs only. And then a blog will already has the author ID, but you can say that the blog will have an author, which will be a relation. Why is it not giving me auto completion? Oh, it will be a user, which will be a relation where I'm forgetting the syntax again, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. Fields is going to be the author ID field, which means this author ID relates to what? It relates to the ID of the users table. Cool. That looks right, almost. Fields colon this thing, references colon this thing. All right. Good to go. Let's look at the schema one more time. What are the 2 lines that I just added? Other than describing the schema, कि हाँ भाई the users model has this schema and the blog model has this schema, I also defined a relationship कि every user can have multiple blogs and every blog will have the author ID such that the author ID from here references the ID field of the users table. So the author is a user such that the author ID here represents the ID over here. When you see the final SQL that is generated from it, you'll see how this translates to a foreign key in the SQL syntax. Let's actually do that and then see how this relationship actually transpiles to the SQL syntax. Again, there's a relationships class where we've discussed this in detail if this feels a little too difficult. Alright, next step, very straightforward, migrate your database. After you write this file, what do you need to do? You need to tell your database, you need to tell this thing right, not this thing, sorry, this thing right here, okay, bhai, good to go. I have initialized my schema, put a users table there, put a blogs table here. So what am I doing? If this is the architecture, this is where my final code will be deployed. This is my machine here, my local machine, my Mac machine. And from this Mac machine, I'm going to tell my database, okay, bhai, please migrate, please run some SQL commands. What SQL commands, Hakirat? Let's see very soon. Let me run this command, npx prisma migrate dev, and a name for the migration. And as you can see, it picks up my avian database. If you look at it, it picks up my avian database from .env. And since I did this before, it says, bhai, something else exists over there. Should I delete this? It seems like you are creating a fresh project. And in my case, yes. So I'm just going to delete all the old data and reinitialize a fresh Prisma project. You should not do that if this is your production database. But if this is a test database, feel free to remove the old data that exists there. If this is the first time you're doing this, then there shouldn't be any old data there. Does not matter. Cool. Seems to have worked. What happened when I ran this command? Go back to the Prisma class. What happens when you run this command? Prisma generates a bunch of migrations for you. It generates, this folder wasn't there before. When I ran this command is when this folder was generated, and this has a migration.sql file which has create a user table, create a block table, and then there is a foreign key that is added right over here. It generated this SQL for us. This SQL was then run on my actual database. My actual database now has a user table and now has a blocks table. That's what migration means. That's what you do anytime you change schema.prisma. If in the future I add a date of birth field here, let's say, which is a string, and I add, a city field here, which is also a string. If I make these changes, I need to run this migration command, give it a better name. For example, added DOB and my city, and run this again to tell my database that this database has, these tables have been altered. So please add a DOB field, please add a city field. Cool. Let me invert this and we're good to go. We have a very basic blogging application ka schema. I have migrated my database as well. We're done with the first, let's see, 5 steps. Last thing, we need to generate the client. Here, what was the client? Again, go back to the Prisma class. The client is as the name suggests, it's a bunch of code. It's a bunch of files that get generated for you so that you can use those files in your index.ts. Eventually, in this index.ts, you want to run very simple commands like this. You want to run a command like user.add username something and password something, or blog.update, so on and so forth. So this blog that you can get, or this user that you can get, this simple functions that you can call come from a client, and the client also is basically looking at schema.prisma and is getting generated, right? When you run this command npx prisma generate, you have to add -- no engine because we are running it in a serverless environment. If you are not running it in serverless, if you're using Express, you don't need the -- no engine flag. But since we're running in a serverless fashion, you basically don't need to generate a few things when you're running this command. That's what -- no engine does. If you want to read about this more, go to the blog post on how you can deploy a Cloudflare Workers application. They explain this in a little more detail. When I run this command, what happens? Prisma looks at schema.prisma and it generates a bunch of TypeScript files for me. Let's wait for it to finish and then we'll see. Taking a long time, very surprised. Seems like it's doing something with my data. It shouldn't take this long if it was only generating a few client-side files. So my guess is whenever you run generate, it also migrates your database, or tries to migrate your database. My database is already migrated, so it doesn't matter. But I feel like it's trying to connect to my database, which is why it took a little bit longer. Either way, as you can see, what does the log says? The log says generated a Prisma client to /node modules /@prisma/client. Harkirat, does that mean that this node modules /@prisma/client was just generated? Yes. When you ran this command, this folder got generated, and now you can use this folder in your application. This folder will expose a bunch of, a library was created for you, and now you can import from that library things like user, prisma/client, and run the specific commands like user.find, user.get, so on and so forth. All right, that's what the client generation means. This is common across Prisma. Whenever you're creating a Prisma application, number one, anytime you change your schema.prisma file, number one, you migrate, number two, you regenerate the client. All right, now that this is done, let's see what it says. Now you have to do something extra because you are using Prisma Accelerate, because you are using this offering right here. and not connecting directly to a database. Again, all of this, if you want to do it yourself, Hakirat, how would I figured this out if you hadn't written this blog post? There's an official blog post by Prisma. You would have just Google Cloudflare workers with Prisma, and then you would have reached this deploy to Cloudflare workers official doc by Prisma and gone through it. This doc is where this specific doc is inspired from. All right, and they explain in detail, not really in detail, but they share a little bit with you as to why you need this specific library, and why you need to initialize your client like this. These are the lines that you need to add to initialize your client. If you remember in Express, the syntax was much simpler. You did not have this line of code, and this variable was simply this much, const Prisma equal to new Prisma. But now, since we're using Prisma with Accelerate, we're using Prisma with their offering, we have to initialize it a different way. Again, all of this you would have found on the official Prisma doc where I googled and reached how do you deploy a Prisma application in a serverless Cloudflare worker. All right, let me copy this and explain what they are. Let me go to index.ts and paste this code right here. Now here comes an interesting observation / problem with not just serverless, specifically Cloudflare serverless functions. If you ever want access to an environment variable in Cloudflare, for example, the database URL which we put in wrangler.toml, this right here, if you want access to this in your index.ts file, you cannot access it globally. This environment variable is not accessible to you globally, which is why this Prisma initialization actually needs to happen inside each and every route. I repeat, inside each and every route that exists. For example, this is the first API/v1/signup route. I have to initialize the Prisma client here because the environment I only have access to via this C variable. This C variable is what will give me access to the database URL which I need to inject in the Prisma client. So one pattern you will notice throughout is we either reinitialize Prisma in every route, specifically the routes that need to hit the database, or we can do something fancy and extract this logic out into a middleware. But either way, you cannot globally define this because you don't globally have access to the database URL, which is why you'll see this weird thing of us reinitializing Prisma again and again in every route. The second slightly weird thing if you're doing this in TypeScript is that you'll notice this gives you an error. Firstly, let's look at the syntax. What have I written here? I've gotten Prisma client from @prisma/client/edge. So if you're using Cloudflare workers or even like other serverless environments, if you're deploying Cloudflare Prisma on the edge, what does the edge mean? In a serverless offering, in a place that's not a simple EC2 server, for example, in those cases, you have to fetch the Prisma client from not @prisma/client, but @prisma/client/edge. And you have to import with Accelerate from @prisma/extension Accelerate, the dependency that we added a few seconds ago. And the way to initialize the finite Prisma client is new Prisma client. You give it the URL of your Postgres connection $extends with Accelerate. This part is important if you are using a connection pool URL. If you are using the Prisma Accelerate offering that we saw a few seconds ago, if this is the URL that you are putting over here, then you need to add a $extends with Accelerate, and only then will your Prisma variable be able to talk to the database. All right. Hopefully this sounds straightforward. The only extra thing that's a little weird here is that the data source URL gives you a type error. There's a red squiggly here, and this isn't a JavaScript error. This isn't an error that is running when I'm running my JavaScript code. It's a compilation error. If I try to compile the code, then TypeScript will tell me that something is incorrect, don't compile it this way. But you see that there are red squigglies here, which means TypeScript is not happy. TypeScript is telling you okay, there is an error with the data source URL. If you hover over it, it says type unknown is not assignable to type string or undefined. It says okay, by c.env.database, I don't know what that is. In fact, it says c.env is possibly undefined. Basically, we don't know the type of .env. We don't know the type of the environment variables you are injecting. You might say, Harkirat, Wrangler.toml we have written very well database._URL. Why does TypeScript not know? Okay, there is a very nice environment variable that exists over here. Why is TypeScript saying this may not exist? And the answer is TypeScript does not understand your toml file. It doesn't even know an environment variable from here is getting injected in this index.ts file. TypeScript doesn't even look at your toml files. So you have to explicitly tell it the type of environment variables that you're injecting. And the way to do that is this. Is what I thought, but we'll see. Maybe I'm missing something. E extends env equal to variables. Bindings. There you go. After some figuring out through the TypeScript types, this is how you can initialize Hono if you want TypeScript to not complain. If you want TypeScript understands this is a string, then you have to tell Hono, I am going to give you a database URL. Don't worry. This is the type of the database URL. So let the developer use c.env.database URL. It will be injected, don't worry. Harkirat, does it mean if I go to wrangler.toml and remove this, then TypeScript will complain? No, TypeScript will still not complain. As I said, TypeScript does not understand wrangler.toml has something. You have to explicitly tell it here. And then if you are the TypeScript developer, if you are the person who's writing this code, make sure you are actually injecting this. Otherwise, you'll see runtime errors. You will see this database URL as undefined, and that will give you a bunch of, problems. So this is the first difficult bit to go through, which is when you're initializing applications in the future as well, a lot of times you have to pass in generics to make TypeScript happy. Specifically in this case, we had to pass in this binding, which represents what c.env will contain. And in our case, we have said it will contain a database URL. This is enough to generate the Prisma client. And from here, life is smooth. You just have to write the application logic, things like prisma.user.create and so on. So that's what we'll do next. Let me quickly go to the slides and see if we've missed anything. But I think that's pretty much all for slide 4. Slide 5 asks you to create a sign up route and add JWT to the sign up route. So let's first quickly create the sign up route and then let's go from there. What do you think is the logic I should add here in the sign up route? I need to do a prisma.user.create data and then get the username, password, things like these from the context variable here. C const body equal to await c.json. If you remember, this is how you would, maybe not this, body.json. I'm going to look at the solution, but if I was you, I would, go to Hono docs and then figure out, I can do that as well, how to get the body in an API route. For example, it'll probably be here in context. So if I go to context, search for body, I see nothing. There you go. Body, and then here, looks like the wrong body. c.rec.json or something like that probably. There you go. So this is how you would get the body. Probably have to await it. I think this returns a promise. The JSON body, and then what do you have to do here? Simply username equal to body.username, password equal to body.password, and then name body.name. A few callouts here. We haven't added Zod as the validation library. We haven't hashed the password. So these are two things that we should eventually add. Zod we will add today. Password hashing I'll create a dedicated video on. So for now, what do you have to do? This is it. Await prisma.user.create. Harkirat, what if the user with this username already exists? You are adding no checks here. Well, if you remember, in schema.prisma, I clearly said username string @unique, which means even if I call .create with a username that already exists, this will fail, this will throw an exception, which is why ideally you should put this inside a try catch block. Okay, by if there is an error, then you tell the user c.status 403 or 411, whatever you want to return, a bad status code, and tell them user already exists with this email, or a better error message. It isn't necessary that this is the only error that will cause for this to throw. So you can return like a better message here, or just say, invalid. Either way, putting this inside a try catch is enough to catch the case where, a duplicate email comes in. If someone tries to sign up with an email that's already taken, I don't necessarily have to first, do a const user already exists equal to prisma.user.find. I can do that as well, but this approach works because I have a check at the database level. Alright, great. I think that's enough for the sign up route. Let's quickly see if this works or not. npm run dev. Let me also one more time just show you the whole thing. It says app.post on this specific route. First get the body. Here is where we need to add Zod validation. Initialize the Prisma client and then do a .create inside a try catch block, so that if this throws, the user gets back a 411 with a text that says invalid. Let's try to send this request in Postman. Let me restart this. API v1 user/signup. Body contains email and a password. If I send this request, it takes a long time. Ignore this timestamp that you see here, and it says invalid eventually. What have I done wrong? Oh, it says 411 length required. Interesting. It means the database threw an error. But why? I don't think this email was used already. Why did the database throw an error? The way to debug that is actually log e and then resend the request, and now you will see an actual error log which says username field is missing. Basically, I am sending the wrong inputs. This guy expects body.username. I am sending body.email. So let me change that, and then good to go. It says hello Hono. It should probably say signed up. And then let me try to send the request. This time it should say invalid because this email already exists. Let me again try with a different email, and it says sign up. Alright, great. That looks pretty good, Hakirat. I think given the sign up route, it's very easy to write the sign in route as well. But there's one thing that's missing. There's one thing I've not done here yet. Can you guess what that is? That is authentication. We haven't yet added the logic to return JWT on the sign up route. If you remember, the whole point of a sign up and a sign in route is at least the sign in route, the whole point is this. But for the sign up route, the first thing the sign up route needs to do is put an entry in the database. The second thing the sign up route needs to do is return back to the user. If this is the request the user that sent at /signup, the second thing that this guy needs to do is return the user a JWT, a JSON web token, so that if this is your user, the user has access to this JWT, they can store it in local storage and then eventually send it in every request. So the sign up and the sign in request both need to return back a JWT, which means we first need to create a JWT as well. The question is, how do you create a JWT? Should we create it the way we did back in the Paytm project? The answer is no, unfortunately. The JSON web tokens library that we use there also does not work with Cloudflare workers, and hence we need to use the JWT library that Hono provides you. So if you go through the docs of Hono, you will notice in the helper section there is a JWT library that they have created. So we can use this JWT library to generate the token. Let me go back here, import sign from Hono/JWT, and then actually sign the ID of the user. So const user equal to await this, and then const JWT equal to await sign the payload, which in this case, let's say it's ID, which is user.id, and the secret, which I can hard code as a string as well. But ideally, I should just store this secret also in wrangler.toml right here. So right below database URL, I should put, let's call it JWT_secret, which could be anything, Harkirat1 secret, and use this over here. Get access to it how? c.env.jwt_secret. Harkirat, there is a red squiggly. How can you fix that? Whatever environment variables you introduce, put them in the bindings section here so that TypeScript knows that this actually exists. Given you have the JWT, you can return that to the user. So the user has access to the token that they can send in every subsequent request. This is the almost right implementation of sign up. What's missing is Zod validation, but we'll get there very soon. Alright, that's the sign up endpoint. Let's quickly try to send a request to it in Postman. This email probably already exists, which is why I'm going to change this. And it says signed up still. Let me restart the process. Maybe I forgot to save the file. Oh. Need to put this inside double quotes. And then let's restart. Looks good. We go back to Postman, send the request, and it gives me back invalid. It says signed up still, because this started on a different port. I'm still hitting my old process. Let me hit the new process that I just started. And now I get back a JWT. If I look at the JWT in jwt.io, it has ID :9. This is what the JWT decodes. Oh, 1 second. This is what the JWT decodes to. If you're still confused, Harkirat, how were you able to decode the JWT without the secret? We need to go back to the JSON Web Tokens class. JSON Web Tokens don't necessarily mean that other people cannot decode them. Other people cannot verify them, which is something we'll do eventually. But yeah, as you can see, ID 9 is what gets encoded in this JWT, which is great because now we have almost everything that's needed in a sign up route. Can you guess the sign in route? Is it very similar to the sign up route? I first need to get the body. I can in fact copy the whole thing and paste it here. What needs to happen in the sign in route? Number one, I need to get the body. Number two, I need to check dot find one or find first, where username is this thing and password is this thing. And if user doesn't exist, then I need to return status code of 411 or more specifically 403, which stands for unauthorized. 403 is the common status code for unauthorized. Basically, this is the status code that usually returns when you send the wrong credentials. If I can almost guarantee, if I go to facebook.com and if I send the wrong credentials, then it returns me back a 403. Network, oh sorry, login. Let's see, login, pending, oh CTC. I don't see a 403, they don't, but 403 is the standard code that you return when you tell someone here unauthorized. In the end, these status codes don't mean much. The front end most of the time ignores them, but 403 is the standard status code when you want to tell someone they're not authorized for a specific service, and specifically if they're sending the wrong email and password, then 403 status code makes sense. Along with that, we're sending them invalid. You could also, get fancy here and return them something like this: incorrect credentials. All right, that's the second route. If you want to look at the whole thing, this is what it looks like: a try catch block inside which we first get the user. If user doesn't exist, which means there is no user with this username and password, which means the user has sent us the wrong credentials, then we return back a 403. If a user does exist, then we again create the JWT and return it back to the user. So if I now go to Postman and send the request for a user I signed up with before on /signin, it says cannot send request because I haven't started it. So let me quickly start it. What port is it running on? It's running on 57 something something something. So let me paste that here, send, and it gives me back the JWT. If I send incorrect credentials, if I send the wrong password, then it says incorrect credentials and I get back a 403 status code. All right, that's all for the sign in route. So we were able to complete the sign up and the sign in route. This is what the code looks like finally. The sign up route, feel free to take a screenshot. I'm sorry for this specific thing here, I'll get rid of this very soon. And this is the sign in route. Feel free to take a screenshot and marinate it, try to write it yourself, and also test it out in Postman just like I did. With that, let's move to the next section. The next section is going to be on middlewares, because before we reach the actual blog endpoints, we need to add authentication to them, which you use middlewares for. Let's get to that next. Alright, next up we have to do two things. We have to implement all the blog routes, that's step 7, and we have to implement a middleware for all our authenticated requests. First up, before we do any of this, let's structure our app a little bit better. You'll find the notes for that here in blog routes. There's a section for better routing here at the bottom, right here. So you can read through this if you want, or write it yourself. TLDR is Hono lets you group routes together, something like this. You can be like app.route/book. Every request that comes to /book, please get routed to this specific Hono handler. So we're going to use this app.route to create better routing in our backend application. So let me go back to our code base, and here I'm going to do a app.route API/v1/user. All user requests should go to a user router, and app.route/API/v1/blog. All blog requests should go to a blog router. And now I can define them in different files. So let me create a better file structure here. Inside source, let me create a folder called routes and define user.ts and blog.ts. Inside user.ts, let me export const user router equal to new hono, and then move all the user routes here. So if I go back to index.ts, let me copy the sign up and sign in route and move both of them here. I need to change this to just /sign up now, because /API/v1/user already come from index.ts. So any request that's coming to /API/v1/user /sign up will now reach here. Let me also copy over all the imports. And again, when we're initializing hono, let's pass in some bindings. Database URL is a string, good to go. And JWT secret is also a string. So all I've done is just copied over the logic into a different file, put it in a user router, and this user router is what I'm putting here in /API/v1/user route handler. Let me import this at the top as well, so that we have a slightly better structure. Similarly, I'm going to move all the blog routes to the blog router, which I'll define here in blog.ts. Export const blog router equal to new hono, and put all the blog routes here. They don't do much right now, but we'll add the logic to do slightly more with them very soon. Alright, again, this will be slash. Basically just make all of these slash, and this will be bulk and not blog. Alright, good to go. Take the blog router. Also probably need to add the variables here as well, because we'll be using JWT. We might be using actually, I don't know, but irrespective of whether or not we're using them, good to have the bindings here that we're finally going to have in our application. Alright, let's write the logic to first import this in index.ts. And now let me start to write the logic of the blog router. What does the blog router need to do? Number one, all of these need to be authenticated. So I need to write a middleware here. Anytime a request comes to blog router dot use, anytime a request comes anywhere on this specific router, I'm going to do a bunch of authentication checks here. Let me do next for now. But eventually I'm going to, do a bunch of auth checks, write all the JWT decode logic. And secondly, I need to implement all 4 of my endpoints. Let me first implement all the endpoints, and then we'll implement the middleware that will do the actual decoding of the token. What does the post endpoint need to do? It needs to create a new blog. So first I need to initialize Prisma. I can copy that over from this thing right here. Get the body, initialize Prisma, make this async. With accelerate, and then what do I need to do? It's as simple as await prisma dot blog dot prisma client is not imported from the right thing, so let me make this edge, and now let me do prisma dot, still doesn't give me types, which makes me a little anxious. Blog, there you go, dot create data. I need to send the title, which will be body.title, this content, body.content, and then user ID or author ID, which will be what? What will the author ID be? Where can I extract this author ID? This extraction will happen in the middleware. The middleware is the place where you take the token from the user and actually extract the user ID from it and pass it from the middleware to the actual route handler. This is something we've discussed many times when we discussed authentication in our original Express approaches. So it's just that the syntax has changed for creating a middleware, but in the end this middleware will somehow extract the user ID and then pass it down to the route handler. That is what this blog router needs to do. For now, let me hard code author ID here, and eventually we'll see how we can fix this. Alright, let me return back the ID of the blog that's created. So let me do a const blog equal to this thing and then return JSON with ID, which is blog.id. Similarly, what does put need to do? It needs to update the title and the description. So it's as simple as get the body and then update where ID is body.id and then the updated data is title and content. Author ID is something we don't need to pass in. The author ID never changes. The put request only needs to allow the user to change the title and the content of the blog. The get one should be straightforward again. Probably find first where ID is body.id and then simply return the complete blog to the end user. Ideally, you should wrap this inside a try catch block because this request can fail for multiple reasons. The blog with this ID doesn't exist, or there is a database connection error. So you should, in case something goes wrong, do a c.status of whatever, not 404, but like a better status code, and tell the user a message that says error while fetching blog post. Alright, figure out a better status code here. 411 isn't necessarily the status code you might want to use here, but something in the 400 series is what you should return to the user as a status code, and then some descriptive message as to what might have gone wrong here. Alright, that's the get endpoint. This is also pretty straightforward. You don't need the user ID here. And lastly, the /bulk endpoint, which needs to return them all the blogs that exist, maybe just the title of them, maybe not the actual contents of the blog, because this will just be shown on the landing page. What will you do here? It will be like const body equal to await c dot. Oh, you don't need the body here at all. So what do you have to do? Initialize Prisma and then simply do a Prisma dot blog dot find many with no conditions, which means give me all the blogs, and then simply return all the blogs to the user. Ideally, you should add something called pagination to this endpoint, which means you shouldn't return all the blogs. You should return the first 10 blogs to the user, and the user can ask for more as they scroll down on the window. You don't necessarily need to return them all the blogs initially. We're not worried about that yet, but this is something you should eventually add. So let me add a to-do here, add pagination. Alright. Cool. I think all the endpoints are done. The only thing that's missing right now is when you are creating an endpoint, how do you find the author ID? How does the middleware that needs to, number one, check whether or not this user actually has access, like is actually logged in, and if they're not logged in, block the request right there. And number two, if they are logged in, get the user ID and somehow pass it from here to here. That's what this middleware needs to do. Once the author ID is present here, we need to replace this one with that actual author ID as well. Let's understand how you can do that next. Alright, before we proceed, we should go through this section on slide 7 or 6, let's see. On slide 6, which says how to pass data from middleware to the route handler. Here you will notice that the C variable that you get access to so often, right? It's called context for a reason. Basically means you put all the context of your request here. What does context mean, Harkirat? What is this new jargony word? Context means that whenever a request is coming, all the things related to that context, to that request, be it the request headers, the body, how to send back headers to the user, how to send back body to the users, all these things are stored in this context variable. And it's not that you just have access to these things. You can use this variable as a store, and you can put more things in this context variable. The way to do that is if you go and search set and get over here. This section, what does it say? It says set the value specified with the key and use it later with the get. What you can do is you can set the user ID is something in the middleware and then use it inside the actual route handler. So that's one way for you to pass data from the middleware over to the route handler, and that's exactly what we want. Why, right? We want our middleware to extract the user details and then pass the user ID over to the actual route handler. So that's what we'll be doing next. If I go to Visual Studio Code and convert this into an async function and do a const token equal to c.header.get. What's the syntax to get headers in Hono? c.header, no, that's to set. How do you get headers? c.rec.header, there you go. c.rec.header of authorization. This is how you can access the auth header. Okay, what is the auth header? What is this something that you added suddenly? If you remember from the Paytm project, or generally when we discussed authorization, when you're in Postman or when you're in a browser, the way you tell the backend that you are logged in is that you send a bearer token, a token that looks something like this. Ki, haan bhai, my authorization header has bearer space the actual token. You don't really need bearer here. You can simply send the token to the end user. Okay, bhai, this is my token that you gave me during sign in or sign up. Please use this token and verify that I am actually Harkirat. So this auth header will have your token and you need to decode this token, which if you remember, you can get from, in this case, Hono/JWT. In our original Express app, we got it from the JSON Web Tokens library. You decode the auth header, JWT secret, const response equal to, or user equal to this, expected one argument but got two arguments. How does decode work? Let's see. It expects just the token. Oh, verify, my bad. You don't pass decoded, you pass verify, because you need to verify the actual JWT. Harkirat, what's the difference between decoded and verify? Decode is similar to what I was doing on jwt.io. If you go to jwt.io and you try to decode a JWT, it gives you the original payload that was converted into this JWT. Decoding anyone can do. Verification only that person can do that has the actual JWT secret, which is why verification is what we need to do here and not decoding. Gives you a type error. Says string or undefined is not assignable to type string. It's saying here auth header ka type, if you look at it, it's either string or undefined, because you don't know here whether or not the user sent you the authorization header. So this can either be a string or undefined. What you can do is add a default string here. Okay, bhai, if this is undefined, then please default to empty string. That way the type of auth header becomes string and the type error in your application goes away. You can also do something like this. If you want, you can add the or empty string check here, or if you want, this is much cleaner. Okay, you make auth header a string irrespective of if the user sent it to you or not, because you back off or you fall back to an empty string. You have that in the auth header. You verify whether or not the user's JWT is correct. If user does exist, which means you got back a JWT, you can set on the context. You can be like c.set user ID user.id. But if user does not exist, then you can simply return the request right there, because you know that the user is not authenticated and hence should not be able to access any of these routes. So here I can do a c.json message you are not logged in, and then maybe the status code here should be something like 403, which is unauthorized. And this is almost okay. Need to await this. This is almost okay. There is a type error here again. It says JWT payload does not exist on context. Basically, you're trying to set user ID here, but context doesn't have user ID. It has rec, it has body, it has JSON. It does not have user ID as a key. So here is another place where you have to explicitly define your extra keys that you're adding to the context by adding a section called variables over here. Okay, bhai, user ID is going to be a string. Don't worry, I will add it. You need to tell the TypeScript compiler that, and only then will this type error go away. How did you figure this out? Trial and error. When you go through the actual section of this context setting on HonoDocs, you'll figure it out. Also, if you go here and look at the types, you'll figure it out. This is the right way to do it. There is a wrong way to do it just to get by, which is you can add a TS ignore here, which basically means please ignore the next line TypeScript compiler. So this specific line tells the TypeScript compiler to ignore all the errors here. You should not do this. This is usually bad. The good thing that you can do is add the variables here, which in our case is just a single user ID string variable. This way the TypeScript compiler knows C will be set on this user ID key, and it will also be fetched maybe later on in a route handler, and both the places you will not get a type error. Cool. What did we do? We got the authorization header from the user. We checked whether or not this token that the user has sent is correct, and if it is correct, we said we're good to go. You can go on to the next route, which is either this route or this route, whatever route the user is hitting. If it is not correct, we tell the user you are not logged in. So here now I can get user ID equal to c.get user ID, and then use this here. You can also replace it with author ID if need be. It still gives you a type error because the user ID is expected to be a number, but this is a string, so you can always you can use this syntax in TypeScript that works. You can be like number of string, which will if this was a string, convert it to a number. If this was a number, then it will stay the same. Or you can do a parse int, which means convert the string into a number. Both of them are fine. I'm going to just use the slightly cleaner TypeScript syntax, and that's it. That's all you need to create all your blogging endpoints. An endpoint to create a new blog, an endpoint to update a blog, an endpoint to get a single blog, and then an endpoint to get all the blogs that exist. Let's quickly go to Postman and see if they actually work though. So let me restart the application. It started on port 53940 and gave me an error actually. App is not defined in index.ts. Const app equal to Hono. This looks right. Let's go to user.ts. Oh, this needs to be user router. There you go. Seems to have worked. 49210. Sorry, 201. Let me paste this here and let me first send the request to sign up one more time because I've forgotten my JWT. Send an email and a password. It says 404 not found because the route is incorrect. Send that one more time and you get back a JWT. Hopefully, we'll see. Why does it take so long? because the connection pooling was not warm. It's still, since I'm hitting this after a really long time and no one has hit that specific connection pool, they did not have any database provision for me, and which is why, it took a long time the first time. Now it will not take that long. Just like something extra to know. Alright, now that I have a JWT, I need to send various requests now. For example, /blog, a post request here where I'll send the title, my first blog, the content, this is my first blog, and then inside the headers I'll add a authorization header, which in my case currently is just the token as such. If I send this request right here, you will see it says internal server error, which means something went wrong. Let's try to debug. Context is not finalized. Oopsie daisy, this is something new. This might take some time to debug. That makes a lot of sense. Whenever you're calling next, which I did here in the blog router, you need to await it, which basically also tells me okay, our application is working as expected because the control did reach here. Let me try that one more time now. It is taking a long time, which is good. There you go, I got back an ID2, which means a new blog was created. Let me try that one more time. ID3, ID4. Great. Let's try the put endpoint. The put endpoint lets you update a given blog post. So an existing blog post, I'm updating the title to my new blog, and then content also is my new blog. So let me try to update the title and the blog, the content of the blog. Returns ID4, which means seems like the update has happened. But how will I be able to confirm? If I send a get request for the fourth blog, even though let me check one thing. Blog router dot get ID equal to body.id. So this is slightly incorrect. The get endpoint needs to get the ID from this URL. Basically, the user will send you a request to /blog/4 or /blog/5. So the ID needs to come not from the body. In fact, body makes no sense in get requests. You should never use body in a get request. You should use either these params or query parameters. In our case, I'm going to use these params. So it will look something like this: const ID equal to c.rec.param ID. Doesn't have to await, and this ID is what I need to send to the database after I convert this into a number. There you go. So this will be a string. I convert this into a number, and I get this specific ID, which is the final dynamic route here by using the syntax const ID equal to c.rec.params ID. I'm trying to get the parameter ID, which is a dynamic parameter in this variable. Now that I have this variable, I can simply do a prisma.blog.find first, get the first blog which has this ID, and then return that to the user. If I now send this request, you will see it says 404 not found. API v1 blog, I need to maybe restart the application and change the port. Send, it says 404 not found. That is fine, we'll figure it out. .get /:id API v1 blog ID. It is a get request. I am sending a put request. Third, needs to return the right, seems like it's returning the right blog. Fourth, my new blog, which means it's returning the updated blog, which tells me everything seems to be working as expected. The last endpoint to check is /bulk endpoint, which should return me the, but it is currently returning errors and blog post. We'll see what it is returning, and we'll see how we can make it slightly cleaner. So let's go to the /bulk endpoint. What error does it throw? Error while fetching blog posts. Oh, the control is still reaching here, even though I'm sending a request to /bulk, because this is catching everything. So what is happening is, how does it know /blog/bulk? I'm not asking for the blog with the ID bulk, because I said कि भाई any request that's coming to /:id, which basically this route also satisfies that condition, /API/v1/blog/id. So the control is reaching here, what you can do to get around this is either you can change this to, or you can't do much. Either you can change this to, get/:id, or you can move this up the chain so that this is the first handler that gets called. And if the control doesn't reach here, then the control reaches here. This way, the bulk endpoint will be called, will reach here, and this will be the handler for it. And anything else, if it comes after /blog 1 2 3 4 5, that goes here. Cool. Let me save this and restart. Bulk, and you will see it returns me all of my blogs, blog 1, blog 2, blog 3, blog 4, which is great. I have all the backend endpoints that I need to create the front end for my application now. There are a few things that are missing. We don't have Zod validation. We haven't hashed the password. We haven't paginated this endpoint, which are like good things for you to try. I'm happy to make a video on them. None of them are too difficult. The things that we sort of need from this point are, let's go back to the slides, is number one, Zod validation, which is something we'll do because we'll learn a few things from it. But other than that, that's it. That's sort of what our application needs to, support on the backend. There are 10 different things we should add, but we have a basic routing structure. We have authenticated routes. We have a way for users to sign up and sign in, and all distributed in various files, which is like a good start for our application. All right. Next up, let's see what the slides say. First, they say please check all of these in Postman, so try to hit all of these endpoints in Postman. It also gives you some details as to what this bindings is, what these variables are, which is something we discussed. And then deploy your application. This is the most interesting bit, right? You've written it locally. You're still using a production database. By production database, I mean a database that's already deployed on the internet. So why not deploy your application, which is what I'm going to do next. Let me go to Visual Studio Code. And what was the way to deploy your application? If you remember, first you have to do a npx wrangler login. You have to log in to your Cloudflare account, which I already have, so I don't need to. Then you can check whether or not you're logged in by running the command npx wrangler who am I, and it will return you your Wrangler spelling is incorrect. Wrangler and it tells you this is my user email. These are the accesses that I have. I specifically have access to write to a worker, which is why if I run npm run deploy or wrangler deploy, either works. It will deploy my application on the internet. It will deploy my worker to a specific URL, which I'll have access to here in a second. As you can see, it also put my variables over there, my production database URL and a JWT secret. You can actually update them in the Cloudflare worker. Let's try that very quickly. But before that, if you open this, you will notice my worker is deployed. I can now replace all my Postman routes from localhost to this production endpoint. And this is cool because this is a free application that is deployed. They don't charge anything for a really long time. I think the limits are 100K requests in a day, after which you begin to get charged. So it's one of the easiest way to get off the ground if you're building an application that you cannot anticipate the load for. All right. The next thing that's good to know is if you go to Cloudflare dashboard, you can actually update the environment variables if you want. So let me try that and show you very quickly. If I go to the workers section over here, workers and pages, it shows me the week 13 offline worker. I can actually go to settings, variables, and update these secrets with whatever your production database might be. In the end, you won't really be checking in this wrangler.toml that has your production database here. You'll probably have some local database or some dev database, generally just a local database. And even your JWT secret that's hard coded on GitHub isn't something you should be using in production. So you should update these variables to, prod JWT secret or something like that. You can also encrypt them, so like no one can see them here on the dashboard and they just directly reach your application. And it says your environment variables have been saved. I've changed my JWT secret, which tells you what? It tells you if I go to Postman now and if I send the same request, do you think it will get accepted? I changed the JWT secret. So this JWT is no longer valid, which means if I send this request, it should return me. Should have returned me a 403, return me a 500, which is not great. It means, our application isn't handling unauthenticated requests very well. I know the reason for it. The reason is, if you go to the blog router, this throws an error. So I should ideally put this inside a try catch. Let me do that really quickly. So that if this verification fails, the user still gets back a clean 403 with the message that says you are not logged in. Let me redeploy this. And now if I go here and send the request, it gets back the blog because I updated the variables. Let me re-update the variable and change to something random. And now if I send the request in Postman, you'll probably see a 403. So this is a much cleaner message. And I got this cleaner message back because I put this await verify inside a try catch, because this throws an error if the JWT secret changes and the auth header no longer was created with this JWT secret, which is why this is throwing an error. Earlier it was giving me a 500 status code here. Now since I put it inside a very nice try catch, it is giving me a 403. Harkiyat, how was it giving a 500 status code? Anytime your server just crashes, anytime there is a exception that is thrown, then Hono or even Express returns a 500 status code to the end user, which is why, if I did not put this inside a try catch, it was returning a 500. Alright. Let's see what's next, even though we're pretty close now. There are a few good things to do after this, which is add Zod validation to your backend. Let's do that next. Even though we're doing Zod a twisted way, we're doing all the Zod validation in a separate NPM module. I'll share what that is very soon. Let's move to the next section on adding Zod validation to your application. Alright, let's understand how would you add Zod validation to your endpoints. Let's go back to the code and see where exactly would we need Zod validation. Let's begin with the user.ts endpoint. The body that the user is sending you is something you should sanitize. You should make sure that this body follows a certain format. Specifically in our case, the format needs to look something like this. Email, a string, and then password, which is a string, and then name, which is an optional string, right? And we've seen before the best way to do this is Zod. Zod lets you do input validations the right way, make sure that the body that the user is sending is correct. So one ugly way, not an ugly way, it's a decent way to do this is number one, you install Zod in your project. Number two, you import Z from Zod. Number three, you define const user sign up input equal to, make it a small s, Z dot object username, Z dot string dot email, and then password, Z dot string dot minimum 6 characters, and then name, which is Z dot string dot optional. And then at the top of the route, you do a const success equal to sign up input dot safe parse body, and if the input isn't successful, then you return the user right there. You do a c dot status 411, which means incorrect inputs, and then return c dot json a message that says inputs not correct. This is one way to bring Zod validation to your project. You can also move all of these into a different file and import them from there. Let me remove this from here and put it in a separate file called Zod.ts, and then import this sign up input from that file. This works. This is not a bad approach. The problem comes when you need these types, when you need this type on the front end. Eventually you will be writing front end code as well, and in the front end code also you need to know now whether you want to send the username or you want to send email. What this key looks like is something you need on the front end as well. And there is something we discussed called type inference in Zod last week, which basically says कि भाई given this constant, given this variable, constant variable, I confused you here, given this runtime variable, given this thing that actually will exist in a JavaScript file, you can actually extract the type that looks something like this. कि username is string, password is string, name is an optional string that you might use on the front end like this. You can be like export const sign up, not const type sign up input equal to z.infer type of sign up input. If this syntax seems confusing to you, there is a video last week where we covered type inferences in Zod. The TLDR is this is a runtime variable. This is something that actually gets used at the top of this handler. This is something that actually runs. But if you want just the inferred type of the input, if you just want that username is a string, password is a string, and name is an optional string, then you can get that by using this z.infer that lets you infer the type of the input. This thing is a type. This is something that will not exist in your JavaScript file. The reason I introduced this is because the front end will need this. Whenever we write the front end code, it would be good for front end to have access to this variable so that the front end knows it needs to send a username and a password to the backend. And you know, the developer of the front end doesn't need to open the code and then look at this route and then figure out, okay, oh, I need to send username and password. This is a very ugly way for the front end developer to figure out the inputs, which is why it is good for you to, wherever you have defined the Zod types, also export the types. So wherever you have defined the Zod variables, also export the types so that your front end can use them. The only problem is you are exporting this from the backend code. How will your front end use it? In the end, we will have two different folders, right? We will have this week 13 offline is just the backend code. The front end code will exist in a different folder. So this isn't the right place to export the sign up input type. This might be the right place to export the sign up input Zod variable. This backend project is probably the right place for you to define this, but not this front end variable that you use on the front end. So here is where I will introduce something that will become eventually very important when we reach monorepos, which is you should structure your application into multiple modules. Until now, we have written the backend code. This should be one module of your project. The front-end React code should be another module of your project. And you should introduce a third module called commons, which will be used by both the React project and the Cloudflare backend project. The backend project will use another module to get the Zod type, the Zod variable, and the front-end React project will use the common module to get the Zod type. This way, your front-end project doesn't need to import anything from the backend project. You don't want your front-end project and backend project to talk to each other at all, or this guy importing something from this guy or vice versa. What you can do is whatever both of these guys need, you can extract into a separate module. You can independently deploy this module on npm. That way, this guy and this guy can both access this common variable. You don't need to do this today thanks to monorepos, which is something we will eventually understand. But for today, until you don't understand monorepos, we are going to create a separate commons module, define all the Zod variables here, all the Zod types here, and then import them in Cloudflare backend, the Zod variables here, the Zod types here, and that's how we'll structure our application today. Cool. A few prerequisites for this one might be: number one, type inference in Zod. Number two, the NPM deployment pack video that we've done. Both of these we've covered in week 12. So you can go back to week 12 and learn about them if you've not heard of them yet. Alright. I'm going to structure our application a little better now. I'm going to create a folder called backend and then move all the files that we wrote until now into the backend folder. That way I have a top level backend folder. Even.wrangler should probably move here. Even.env should move here. Even.gitignore should move here. Everything should move here. All my code I move to this backend folder, and right besides it I'm going to define a folder called common. This will be this common module where I'll define all the Zod inputs as well as Zod types. So basically this file that I had written, I can now move this file over to the new commons folder that I've created. Let me first initialize an empty TypeScript project here, npm init-y, npx tsc-init. Go to tsconfig.json, change root dir to /source, change out dir to /dist, change declarations to true. Why, Harkiyat? What is this declaration? I have a detailed video on how to deploy to NPM. You can go through that. TLDR is if you want to publish a project to NPM, you should not just publish your JavaScript bits, but also publish your types. That's what declaration lets you do. It creates a .d.ts file that you publish to NPM. If you don't understand this, we have a video on NPM in week 12 that you can go to and understand this. Alright. These are the three changes we need to make here. Let me create a src folder and initialize a index.ts file here and start to move our Zod code over here. So if I go to source/src/Zod, all of this code I'll move to commons now, and I can delete this backend/zod.ts file. I'm not going to use this. I'm not going to write any Zod logic in backend. In fact, I can go to the package.json of backend and remove Zod as a dependency. But this guy doesn't even have Zod as a dependency. Where will this dependency move? It will move to commons. So if I go to common and run npm install Zod, here now I will start to write my code. I have created the sign up input. I'm going to export the type for it with a capital S equal to z.infer type of sign up input, and then let me write the sign in input as well. Will just be the username and a password, and export that. We can structure the project better. You can have like a blog.ts file, a signup.ts file. I'm just putting everything in the same file, which should be very easy for you to structure it. Next up, export const create blog input. What all inputs do we expect when the user is creating a blog? We need a title, which is a string, a content, which is also a string. Was that it? I think that's it. Let's confirm. Source routes blog.ts. First guy needs body.title and body.content. Alright. Works. And then export the inferred type as well. Update blog input. Title, content and the ID, which will be, let's say, a string, even though it can actually be a number. So let's just make it a number. And this is going to infer the type here. This is also going to infer the sign type here. This is where it gets really confusing. As your project grows, the file becomes very big, and you can make mistakes like these. For example, I had sign up input here, so you need to be very careful. The good thing is you only have to write it as once, and this doesn't change very often. But whenever you see these Zod validation modules, they're like really big. That's how I've seen it like maintained in a bunch of projects. Right? Cool. Update blog input, and what else? Rest are just gets, which we don't really worry about. You can validate ID over here, make sure it's a string, but it will be a string. It's being passed in the URL. So really the things that you need to sort of check are the post and the put endpoints, for which I have created 4 Zod variables as well as 4 Zod types. Let me put all of them sort of side by side. These are the 4 types that my front end will need. Whenever I create a sign up input box, there when I'm maintaining state, I will use this type. These are the 4 variables that my backend will need. The question is, Harkirat, how can this backend access this common module? How can I import variables from here in this backend? Should I do this? Should I go to user.ts and be like sign up input from /common/index.ts? Is this the right way? The answer is you can do it. As you can see, it doesn't give you an error. But in the end, your project should never have these very large absolute paths to a separate module. Backend doesn't even know what common is, or shouldn't even know what common is. So you shouldn't ideally import absolute paths like this. This might just work here. In fact, it might throw an error as well when you're deploying this to Cloudflare, because Cloudflare might be like, I don't understand anything outside the backend folder. So what you ideally want is, you want to convert this commons into a NPM module. Again, you don't ideally want this. Ideally, you want a monorepo, but since we have not done monorepos yet, what you want in this case, what you would have done in the pre-monorepo days is, or pre-Yarn workspaces days, very, very back in the day, if you wanted to, structure your applications like this, you would publish this to NPM. You would be like, okay, bhai, add 100x devs/medium common is my NPM module. I am going to publish this to NPM so that whoever wants to use these Zod types can actually import them from add 100x devs/medium blog. So this is how you would have done this in the archaic days when Yarn workspaces, NPM workspaces, or monorepos did not exist. Since we're assuming they don't exist right now because we have not understood them, that is exactly what we'll do. We will publish all our code to NPM. So if I look at package.json here, I've added add 100x devs/medium common. This is the name of my NPM module, and I'm going to first NPM login is something you should do. I've already logged in. Again, go to the video on NPM publishing. It covers this in detail, and then you have to do NPM publish. You probably should change this to dist/index.js because that's what your main file eventually is. You also need to compile the code and generate dist/index.ts, and notice along with the index.js here, it has a index.d.ts which got generated because I set declaration to true over here. Alright, now let's try npm publish. One more thing you can do is have a .npm ignore, inside which you add src. Src is good enough. Harkirat, you are saying .npm ignore, which means probably this means, Harkirat, whatever you are writing here, those folders will not reach npm. Yes. Harkirat, should I add node modules here as well? No, you don't have to. Node modules are by default ignored by npm. But Harkirat, why did you add source here? Source so has my actual code base. This is the TypeScript file. This should probably reach npm. And the answer is no. this, as I've mentioned many times, TypeScript is just a syntax. In the end, what runs is JavaScript code, which you can find here. This is what needs to reach NPM. The actual TypeScript code does not. And all the types of this TypeScript code have already been put in index.d.ts, which is why this much is good enough. You don't need the source folder to reach NPM. Alright, cool G. How do I publish this, Harkirat? Number one, make sure you are not polluting NPM. You don't have a random name here like, Mr. Superstar. Have a name that's prefixed with your username. So @100xdevs is my NPM username. And then whatever I want to add there is fine. I can, not polluting the global namespace of NPM, right? Given that I have this name here and I've replaced this to be my actual main file, you can run, after you run npm login, actually log into npm, you can run npm publish -- public or something like that, -- access public. If you want to create private repos, you can, you just have to pay for them. Since you don't want to pay yet, npm publish -- access public is enough for you to publish a public module. Now, should you publish this publicly is a whole different question. Probably not. You don't want the world to see your, your Zod types. It's fine for now. All right. How can I confirm that this has been deployed, Harkirat? You can actually go to the registry and look at the packages, and the one that we're looking at is @100xdevs/medium component. Sorry, medium common. It does take some time to index, so it's probably why I see a 404 here, but let's wait for a few more seconds. And there you go. I have this deployed onto npm, which means I can install this in my backend folder. In my backend code base, I can simply run npm install @100xdevs/medium common, and just like Express, I get back the module that I created, which has all my Zod types. Again, the question might be, why did we do all of this? Why does this not independently exist in the backend folder only? Why did you have to extract this into commons? And the answer is that eventually we'll have a front end folder here. And now front end can also install this, backend can also install this. Both of them can use the common code base from there. That's why you structure your projects in a way where multiple packages can use the common package, or you eventually will see more and more modules. Cool. Let's look at our sign up endpoint. If I go to user.ts, if I look at it here, it says there's a red squiggly because I'm not importing the right thing. If I do import the right thing, no type errors, good to go. If you test this, you'll see this works. Let's quickly do that. So let me do an npm run dev, and let me hit the sign up endpoint with the wrong Zod inputs. So let me go to Postman, API v1 user/signup, and let me send some random gibberish. And it says 404 not found. API v1 user sign up. It needs to be a post. It says inputs are not correct. If I send username, which is a legit email, and password, which is also more than 6 characters, then you will see it's able to sign me up because Zod validation is working correctly, even though the Zod code is not defined in backend. It's defined in a separate module. This module has been independently published over to npm, and then I fetch that independently published module here. Alright, that's all for this one. Almost. By all for this one, I mean we're done with the backend. We just need to import all the right types and add them in all the user router and the blog router. Let me do that really quickly, and then we'll go through the backend code one more time, and we can call it for the backend. We'll move on to the front end. Alright, I've updated all the routes. Let's go over them one by one. The first one is the sign up route. It has the validation check for sign up input, which comes from where? Which comes from @100xdevs/medium common, the npm module that we've just deployed from here. Sign up input, sign in input, and then we do the Zod validation for sign up over here, Zod validation for sign in over here. And similarly in blog.ts, I've imported create blog input and update blog input, and I'm using Zod validation right here for validating the inputs for creating a blog, and similarly right here for validating the inputs for updating a blog. Let's see if it actually does what it's supposed to do. So if I run npm run dev, copy over the port to Postman and send a request to, okay, let's first sign up. Copy over the JWT, put it in the header, and then replace this with /blog/ that's it, post to /blog. If I send the wrong inputs, it says inputs are not correct. If I add title over here and content over here, then it does work. So Zod validation seems to be working as expected. On the backend, the only thing that's left now is initializing the front end and then using the types from common, specifically these four things at the bottom in the front end, so that this whole mumbo jumbo that we did of creating a separate module for all our Zod validations makes some more sense. So the next thing we'll be doing is initializing a front end project right here. If you go back to the slides, let me open them really quickly. We've pretty much done what's mentioned in slide number 12, which is importing Zod in the backend, basically making sure we import the right inputs from @100xdevs/ whatever is the npm module. In your case, it will be your npm username / whatever, and making sure it does work as expected. When I wrote this code for the first time, I put all the routes in the same file. Now we have a more structured application where all the routes have been put in various routes /blog.tsn, routes /user.ts folders. That's it for the backend. The next thing is initializing the front-end project and then importing the common module there. So let's do that in the next video, just to make sure there are two separate videos. So what have we done in this one? We have completed the backend. Let me push the current code base that I have. Let me first go to wrangler.toml and remove my database URL and JWT secret. This isn't something you should ever commit. And then let me initialize an empty git repo, do a git add dot, and then should probably do something else. Git reset cd common v.git ignore, basically add a git ignore that ignores node modules and the dist folder here in commons, because I don't want to commit these node modules and dist over in GitHub. And then do a git add dot, do a git status just to make sure things are fine, things look okay, and then git commit, create a commit, and then do a, okay, I already have a Hono boilerplate code where I push this. Let me create a fresh repository on 100xdevs cohort 2 where I'm going to push this code right now. You can look at this exact code over here. Let's see, let's call it week 13 offline. Let's make it public. And you can look at the code over here if you'd like. Next up, I'll be adding the front end module here in the next video.